we need a greater degree of counterintelligence to be able to fight against this World War III threat. Really, for a total paradigm shift. We're not talking about some kind of slowing down this, or maybe get like one little band-aid on this part of the fundamental crisis that we're facing. We're talking about the need to fundamentally shift the hypothesis upon which the world system depends, upon which the relations between nations depend. And we have to go to a higher conception, which is what Helga LaRouche has identified as the coincidence of opposites. And namely the ability, well, that's a whole extended discussion about what that concept really means today, but it's about finding the higher power of the higher one, in this case, the one mankind, that allows us to overleap the contradictions of the present controlling system, the present controlling logic of this geopolitical system, of this fixed, system of Malthusian lies about fixed resources. And fundamentally, what Renee is addressing here, the policy of world government run by the privatization of the U.S. military and across, the Western world, with which Peter Thiel is directly involved. We have to fight that the presumptions that underlie this outlook on the world and successfully defeat them to bring about this new paradigm. That's the goal. And so I just want to say one more thing before I turn it over, which is I want to quote from this remarkable article that Renee wrote, this kind of amazing comment from 2003. She says, the day the Iraq invasion began, March 19, 2003, an editor of EIR magazine telephoned then presidential candidate Lyndon LaRouche to ask, what do we do to stop this war? LaRouche answered, destroy Leo Strauss. So with that provocation, I'll turn it over to Cade.
Hi, yeah, no, I'm particularly excited for tonight's talk. This is an absolutely wonderful article by Renee that's freely available at the link above. I highly recommend checking it out in full. There's so much depth to it that I don't want to go too much into any one detail or another, and just let Renee give her own overview, what she sees as most pertinent. One thing I do want to point out, though, is that there's a similar theme here. If you can listen to the fireside chat that was held last night, that's on the LaRouche Organization YouTube site, you'll hear Marsha Mary Baker talk about the deregulation of the health industry and the privatization of the health industry in the Americas around the same time as what Renee goes into with the military and the privatization of that and how that connects to Thiel and the connections that has with the City of London. And without saying anything further, Renee, please come on in.
Great. Okay. Well, good evening, everybody. And I hope that when you do ask you questions that you mention your name so I can get to know you better. I really appreciate the chance to talk to you, because I think it's extremely important that people like ourselves be in this kind of forum where on the surface we're discussing a particular topic. Tonight we're going to be talking about these weirdos, Peter Thiel and his bizarre sidekick, Alex Karp, and the significance of their network of corporations. But last night I was on a Zoom meeting with a bunch of people I was with Diane Sayre, with a bunch of people out in Woodside, Queens, who were particularly brutally hit when Hurricane Ida occurred. And as a result of more than 20 years where municipalities in the United States have really spent virtually nothing. You can check the Federal Reserve statistics, where they spent virtually nothing on real infrastructure improvement related to water services. things like not clean water, but also things like sewage and stuff like that. And after 20 years of doing that, these people ended up in a situation, you may have heard about this, where in 8 different homes, people drowned in their own basement. I don't know if that's something that's new to you, but it created an uproar in that area. And Diane, who is a very courageous person, put that on her calendar, put that on her target for expanding her campaign to throw out Chuck Schumer from the Senate. She's running against him. And a very feisty group of people in the area who went through this devastating experience of, one person nearly drowned in her basement who's in the group, but also knowing this happened to neighbors, were there last night and discussing, now that the federal government's finally releasing a paltry amount of money for water management across the country. It's really a drop in the bucket compared to the well more than $1 trillion, which is needed immediately to start the water projects that we really need, which go into the many trillions. That they were having this discussion, and they really had their full suit of armor on. These are very extremely ordinary people, but they have that extra degree of moral determination to do something about what is going on. And so they resolved. There were 2 resolutions that came out of the discussion. One is that they're going to get a petition going in their area forcing the city council to have a meeting with them, but also that they're going to work with people in the entire region, including New Jersey, where similarly horrendous things happen. I don't know if you know this, but 30 people died in New Jersey in Hurricane Ida. That they are going to take responsibility for becoming experts on the water projects that need to be built, and really ramming this in the face of the elected officials and putting this on the front of the agenda. And this kind of it was really good to see the readiness of people to fight. And that's the way I look at what you're doing tonight, and taking a Friday night when a lot of other people would just rather sit around smoking dope or, staring out the window or blowing out their minds with, loud, I don't know if you still call it rock music. I sort of lose track of the vocabulary. I'm about to have my 70th birthday, so I've never been good at the popular culture vocabulary, by the way, so my whole life. So I'm really behind the times. But, but we all know what people, think of as Friday night, but you're here to have a serious discussion. And that's damn important, because if there's anything that I've learned in the 50 years that I've worked with Lyndon LaRouche, is that every single human being, without exception, every single one who makes the decision to devote themselves to getting to the bottom, the truth of the matter, and figuring out what they can do, is in fact shaking up the whole world. This may not be obvious to you how that works, but it does work that way. But when we come together to share our determination to do that, the order of our power goes way up, our ability to get something done. And nobody should think that because we didn't solve all these problems before any of you were born. I mean, I understand probably most of you are probably half my age or a little bit less. And, you look at people of my age and you wonder, why didn't you take care of this goddamn mess? And I can understand that. I don't think it's bad if there's a part of you where you say that. But the reason is, as Lynn said, it's been going on for so long, we couldn't get rid of it in a generation and a half. It's going to take some more work, but we absolutely can win this fight. And that's why it's very important that we're having this discussion tonight, and we're doing it at a moment, of course, as you probably know, since you've been reading our literature, or contemplating reading our literature and talking to Daniel and Cade and others and so forth.
Please do more than contemplate. Start with Renee's article.
But that in having this, I presume that you're aware of the fact that as we speak tonight, we're in the midst of one of history's most devastating strategic crises. And this evening, before I got on the phone with you, I read through at Helga's recommendation in her weekly report. I read through the article that appeared January 15th in the National Interest from one of the United States experts on U.S.-Russian relations and international strategic relations, which is this fellow David Pyne, Pyne, who worked for many years for the federal government on the question of EMP, electromagnetic pulse equipment. And I presume you know that, this is part of the array of modern weapons that we're dealing with, the idea that you can create an electromagnetic shock above the atmosphere that can knock out all of the electronics in a land surface, depending on how big the bombs are that you do this with. You don't kill people, but you destroy the economy with a single blow. I'm sure you've heard about this. This is a man who worked on this throughout his life. And like many of the people who have worked on these, not all, but some of the people who have worked on these lethal weapons who are patriotic. I mean, they're doing it because they felt it was necessary that somebody take that responsibility and they had the skills. Sometimes are the most informed about how senseless and dangerous these weapons actually are, and would like to see these technologies put to good use, which in many cases, the same exact technologies that can be so destructive can be turned to fantastically beneficial applications. This man has been writing a series of articles about this current strategic showdown with Russia and China, and she recommended this article where he, in words that are almost a precise echo of what she's been saying, of what we've been saying in our literature, calls for an agreement between the United States and Russia, which I'll read you the quote, which would serve as the centerpiece of a new European security architecture that could end what has been called the Second Cold War between the United States and Russia. And he presents many scenarios, many different versions of what this could look like, but he lands on finally the one that he thinks the Russians would be most likely to accept. And needless to say, it is the one that includes a recognition of the importance of economic development in Eastern Europe, economic development in these areas, and certainly ending all of our military support for Ukraine. On the surface, nominally, this big showdown that we're having right now is about Ukraine, but it's really not about Ukraine. What it's really about is the collapse of the financial system, and that the Western world is throwing a huge temper tantrum, saying rather than clean up our financial system and reorganize it in such a way that we could secure a decent, workable future. Rather than do that, we want Russia and China to bend to our will and become part of this financial system, or we will go to war against you, which is really like watching an immense temper tantrum by a rather undisciplined and unruly child, frankly. It's really pathetic that the transatlantic world has become so degenerate that we would even entertain such an outlook governing our policies. But that's what's going on. That's what's behind this. What's behind this is really not about Ukraine. It's not about Taiwan. It's not about Russia planning an invasion of Ukraine, which they're not. They're only tangentially preparing it if they have no other way of knocking sense into the heads of the Western leaders. But they are not committed to it. They have nothing to gain by simply invading Ukraine. They would like to do anything but that. But they're trying to force the issue by massing troops on the border because NATO is all over the place in Eastern Europe, creating these horribly provocative situations in the same way that the same forces under other umbrellas. NATO's not supposed to be in the Pacific, but it is under other names, are provoking the Chinese about Taiwan, not out of concern for the Taiwanese people. I can assure you of that. This is a game, a very, very, very dangerous game, which is like a reverse Cuba missile crisis. And it's so serious that a lot of people are coming out of the woodwork to work with us on this. Now, that's the context in which about 2 months ago, maybe a little bit longer, I lost my sense of time. I mean, I don't know exactly when this happened, but that Helga LaRouche sent a request to people here in the US that we get on top of this question of who is Peter Thiel. This was presented to an assembly of people at a meeting with Harley Schlanger. He was the person who brought the message from Helga. Most of you probably know who Harley is. You probably listened at least a few times to his morning report. And he said, Helga would like us to get to the bottom of who is Peter Thiel. And would anybody volunteer? And I said, well, I don't know who the heck the guy is, but I'll do it. I have the time. I'll do it. So, and by the way, there was nobody else. There were about 7 of us who were on the phone call, on the Zoom meeting. And I confess, because I understand you're all much more informed than I was, according to what Cade has told me, none of us knew who Peter Thiel was. That's not because we hadn't been doing our homework. It's because on a certain level, he's just part of the scenery. He's really not that important, but he is a very good target for getting at the problem, as I discovered as soon as I started looking into him. And of course, that was just about the time that the biography came out from Chafkin, from Max Chafkin, called The Contrarian, which created a bit of a freakout in the New York financial community. Perhaps some of you happen to notice that. You know, he wrote this several 100-page biography of Thiel, and the Wall Street Journal was really pissed off at him for doing that. New Yorker magazine said, this is a very scary book, but didn't recommend that people read it, which was pretty funny. So I did read it, did a lot of secondary research on it. We had a chance to discuss some of it with William Binney, former technical director of the NSA, et cetera, et cetera. And that's how the article was brought together. Since I've been informed by Cade, correct me if I'm wrong, that most of you know more now than I did when this was first raised. I don't have to tell you who Peter Thiel is. If there's anybody, by the way, if there's anybody who doesn't know what he is, why don't you just speak up? And let's make sure that nobody, as to borrow an expression from George Bush Jr., let's leave nobody behind. Is there anybody who doesn't know who Peter Thiel is?
No responses yet on that. Looks like he's widely understood.
Okay.
Well, I mean, you know, people know him as a personality. The thing is that a lot of people who are on the internet in the past few years politically know him in terms of a Trump boosting Silicon Valley guy who claims to be against the Silicon Valley liberals, or that sort of faction. Mm-hmm. So I think that is a lot of what people know about him, and things that you cite in your article were quite clear in that regard. Some people may know more about him, the fact that he's a techno-fascist sort of a thing. That's a kind of term that people may associate with him as well. But go on. What?
Yeah, this is good. No, what we're going to do is we're going to look at him from the standpoint of a clinical case study, which then gives you a feel for how you make judgments about politics. Really, he's one of these people who just the way he appeared, he might disappear one day. Somebody might get really pissed. I mean, there's so many people outraged at the quality of the work that Palantir does and, dissatisfied with them, but also the fact that even when they do a quote unquote good job in their data analytics, that they're working towards, they tend to be very good at helping the more insidious side of data analytics. And when they do a good job, which is not always, and therefore, people who are involved in trying to defend privacy, civil liberties, proper treatment of criminals for prisons and stuff like that, they suddenly get very alarmed and say, who the heck are these guys? And they're pissed off about this privatization. I mean, if you look at all the problems we have, come back to this water question that I brought up of this meeting I was at Friday night. What was the cover by which the municipalities and the different branches of regional local government ceased investing seriously in maintenance of water supplies. It was under the umbrella of the idea of privatization of services, privatization of water services. We just by the skin of our teeth, we're lucky enough that they haven't privatized most of the police services in the United States. And since nobody wants to take responsibility for firemen, even though a lot of our fire departments across the country are volunteer fire departments, they're not really even hired fire departments. Those two areas, which are so essential for just bare survival, have not been privatized, but just about everything else has. And the argument that privatization works better than having government manage, or as was more common in American history, not manage, but regulate the way services are delivered, because we've always had a lot of businesses involved in these services, private businesses, but the ultimate responsibility for the standard of that area of the economy was the business of the government. So that we had divisions of the government which were involved in regulatory oversight of what private businesses did. And while things were not absolutely perfect, they came damn close to being absolutely perfect. And this is also the way NASA worked. NASA worked with hundreds of thousands of private businesses. But ultimately, the responsibility when we went to the moon, unlike today with this, with this Elon Musk situation, when we went to the moon, the ultimate responsibility was in the hands of government. And as shocking as it may seem to people today who have been trained by the media to believe that, the most corrupt people in the world are elected officials, are politicians, that they're the most corrupt people in the world, the reality of the situation is that when we had this kind of regulatory system and institutions that oversaw it, the country functioned a zillion times better. There's absolutely no comparison. If there was a problem, it used to be, I can tell you, in the 1950s and the 1960s, because of the mentality of the American population of having gone through this in World War II, gone through this under Eisenhower, especially in the second term of Eisenhower, and then through Kennedy, if something didn't work, people demanded that it be fixed, and it was fixed right away. And American technologies at home worked better than anywhere else around the world. We were a standard for the rest of the world. I mean, I think, just to make this very concrete, the image, one of the reference points I'll never forget is when I was growing up after World War II, my father had served in World War II. Most of his friends had served in World War II. And one of the common things that they used to say to each other, because they had been overseas, they had been in Africa, they had been in Europe for the occupation after World War II, they would proudly look at each other and they would say, here in America, I would never do what those Europeans do. I would never buy bottled water. Here in America, we get clean water out of the tap. And people were incredibly proud of this. And the water was not only clean, but in New York State, it tasted absolutely delicious. It was famous for being the best tasting water.
Well, let me...
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I mean, what you're talking about, in terms of this question of privatization, and
right,
especially its effect on New York City, you discussed in the article the role of Felix Rohatyn.
You bet.
And I mean, now you say something rather important in the midway through the article, which is that we should consider in the art of classical drama how it is that even the horrible evil crimes of the past can cast shadows over the present. But if you can understand the nature of those shadows, the nature of the evil, the
Right.
nature of the personalities who did it, then you can actually understand how to create the pathway forward. And basically what you present in part, or you refer to, and then you develop to an extent, is the role of Felix Rohatyn in setting up this policy of privatization. And the context here is that he is such a close associate collaborator of George Shultz that these guys work together to generate over a long time to generate what you call what you refer to as the Stanford University Human Zoo.
Right.
And that's where Peter Thiel of the Stanford Review and so forth come from. That's where Elizabeth Holmes of Theranos came from. That's what we're dealing with Thiel as a representation of or sort of a product of the long shadows of Rohatyn and Schultz, who really pioneered this idea of the privatization of the U.S. military. So, what should people know about Rohatyn?
Oh, I mean, Rohatyn is one of the most despicable and really, it's almost like bone-chilling examples of the way that Synarchism has saturated the American financial community, and there are many implications to this. His career was built around his notoriety, I should say, was built around the way that he and his friends orchestrated this big hullabaloo, claiming in 1975 that New York City had gone bankrupt on its bonds. In reflection, we've never actually gone back and reconstructed what really happened, but many of us, on reflection, suspect that they tremendously exaggerated the situation, and all of this stuff could have been redesigned by the federal government under Hamiltonian principles. I mean, whatever the real problem was, we don't really know what the real problem was because the media was sold on claiming that New York City had gone bankrupt. And so what they did over a period of about a year is they brainwashed everyone that the problem was that politicians don't know how to run financial operations, and that this required that New York subordinate its city council and its mayoralty and its system of government to a panel called the Municipal Assistance Corporation, which until 2008, for 30 years, between 1978, is it 30 years? It's 10, 20, yeah, for 30 years, ran the finances of New York City and turned the place into a complete junk heap, where if you go back before the Municipal Assistance Corporation, working for the New York City had a highly respected, very, very stable system of hiring people for these services that were essential for the city. Whatever corruption might have been in there, it was almost like decent people who were in a constant war with the bankers. And the purpose of the Municipal Assistance Corporation was to make sure that the bankers could really get their way finally. And it was the Municipal Assistance Corporation which got the nickname Big Mac. It sounded like a hamburger, but everybody ended up calling it Big Mac. Dictated what the contracts would be with the school teachers, what the contracts would be with the transit workers, what the contracts would be with the city hospital workers. And then Rohatyn spawned Michael Bloomberg, as his protege, who then went on to be a big banker in town, one of the first of the big multi-billionaires, dominating the environment in the city. And then just a few days before 9/11, well, actually, it was either on 9/11 that the primary was held or something, but who grabbed the Democratic nomination, even though he had been a Republican prior to that, or maybe it's the other way around. He was switching parties. Although I guess by that time he was a Republican. I can't even remember because he was flipping parties back and forth. But it was right around 9/11 that Michael Bloomberg finally was mayor of New York, and then changed the city laws to make sure that he could be mayor for 3 terms. He didn't leave until 2013 when he should have left around 2009. And so even after Big Mac was shut down in 2008, they kept ravaging the city so that there's no comparison in any aspect of daily life of New York to the great city that it was with all of its problems. It was a great city before that, in which the influence of people like Hewlett Jack, who was the borough president, the influence of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, but also of the population. I mean, there was a real second level of leadership in the city in every aspect of life. And the New York City education system was famous in the United States, absolutely famous. Where I'm a graduate of that system, where for example, the achievements of the students who went to school there were comparable to some of the leading private schools in the United States.
So Renee, I want to make sure here I'm not overinterpreting your article too much, because from what I see, when it gets to the privatization of the military, which seems in the similar lines as the sort of Big Mac privatization of city services, there's one paragraph in particular that you have that's talking about Cheney's privatization of the military supply system, I believe during his Secretary of Defense years under Bush Sr. And there's one paragraph here I want to read and make sure I'm not overinterpreting it. It says, the intention behind this program was not to improve national security or even to win wars. Rather, in reaction to the huge 1987 drop in the stock market and to hide the catastrophic effect of Wall Street's post-1971 dictum that the United States must move away from industrial manufacturing to become a services economy, Wall Street embraced a radical privatization of military supply systems and pressured captive politicians to implement that privatization. So the post-71, that's referring to the Nixon shock, of course. And so what I'm wondering is then, when you see this with the privatization of the military, what you're talking with the Big Mac policies, what Marcia Baker
they were stealing income streams. The way it's sort of like the way that Lynn used to talk about what they did to healthcare. The way these guys operate, it's an old-style Venetian mindset that dominates the Synarchist alliance internationally. They sniff around like a bunch of hound dogs, and they say, "Oh, there's income going through that system," which included the military. And they say that income, we want to be able to play with it. We want to be able to wield it our way. And they designed for the different areas of the economy. You know, they started out with healthcare. The first place they went after was healthcare. Then they went after the trade unions, smashed their wages, lowered their wages, and forced, New York, Detroit, all these other places. The first thing that comes above everything else is paying for your bonds, even if they're 100 years old and the subway system that they were issued against is already completely decrepit and should be rebuilt. We don't care about the physical economy. That's the way it has to be done. So therefore, the teachers' salaries have to be cut to get rid of these fantastic, wonderful benefits that New York City teachers were entitled to, which is why such high quality people joined the education system. Okay, you get to the military. It's a little bit more complicated in the case of the military. In the case of the military, you have to keep in mind, there always was a certain amount of bucks going back into the financial system from military production because of the Cold War. It's just been, 5 to 10% of our GDP, ever since the Cold War started was, maybe it was more like 5% for a long time. The military is now 10% of our entire economy. Like if you look at the labor force and so forth. Look at the industrial labor force. It's more than 10%. It goes up to about 20. The number of people employed by the military is about 20% of the industrial. 20 is a figure equivalent to about 25% of the industrial labor force in the United States. So it's one of the last areas in which industry exists. Of course, they're not all employed in industry, but if you think of comparing something like that, because we've been so deindustrialized. But so they always got a certain kickback from the fact that we were building bombers, that we were building airplanes, but they wanted more. After the stock market collapse, they wanted more. But that was driven by one other element, which people have to understand. This was a big turning point in world history, which is when the Berlin Wall came down. when the Berlin Wall came down, and then 2 years later, the Soviet Union voluntarily dismembered itself. There was about a 20% drop in United States defense spending. Oh my God! What are we going to do now? So the privatizers not only, and this article does not go through this. I had another article. I don't know if people ever noticed the book that was put out by a veteran by the name of Christian Sorensen called Understanding the War Economy. I don't know if people have heard of it, but I did a review of that. And I went through this in a little bit more. More things can be written about this. There's a lot more research that can be done about this. But in any event, you have a situation where what the bankers demanded was a super cartelization of military production, a phase change in how it was organized from the top. And then also this really nasty thing happened where during the because we're talking about the post Berlin fall of the Berlin Wall, the kind of world that we're living in, okay? In which all of a sudden, all of this massive expenditure that was going into keeping the Russians at bay suddenly didn't have to be spent anymore. I mean, people should know, if you look at it in constant dollars, not inflated dollars, but if you mark down the current defense budget to constant 1980s dollars, the current defense budget is smaller than what Ronald Reagan was spending. And that was a result of a big problem in U.S.-Soviet relations, in NATO-Soviet relations. There was a big problem in the 1980s. We were, because of the influence of these people, the influence of people like Zbigniew Brzezinski, but also British influence in the Soviet bloc, we were looking nuclear war in the face. There was a really very big danger. That is why Ronald Reagan was so interested not only in getting elected president, he actually saw his primary mission in getting elected president to do something about the nuclear war danger. But that is why he was interested in the creative work that Lyndon LaRouche had done on this, where he said, look, the only way we're really going to shake up this situation in Moscow, which was a mess, it really was a mess. The only way we're going to shake up this situation in Moscow is by proposing to them collaboration on building anti-ballistic missile laser defense systems. And Reagan loved that idea and named it. He's the person who chose the name Strategic Defense Initiative. So a lot of money was going into military expenditures at that time.
Renee, let me just pause you for a moment, because I think this is a good time to talk about tomorrow's event at 2 p.m. with the Schiller Institute.
Thank you.
Everyone who's on this, if you look at the tweet that I just shared at the top, you have it's the link to RSVP for tomorrow's event at 2 p.m., which is called Can War with Russia Still Be Averted? Helga LaRouche will be speaking. Paul Gallagher, who's a co-editor of Executive Review. Harley Schlanger, who, as Renee said, you may know from his updates on the LaRouche Organization YouTube page and his weekly interviews with Helga LaRouche. I can strongly recommend subscribing to the TLO YouTube and listening to his updates every day. They're like Monday through Friday. They're about 10 minutes. But in addition to those three, we will have a leading, a high-level diplomat of a nation of significance in this discussion. And I want to urge people to listen to that, because, I mean, the very thing that Renee's talking about is you have to consider the idea that the whole world could have gone in a completely different direction after the fall of the wall. And that was the direction that was defined by LaRouche, by Helga LaRouche, by his associates, including Renee, who fought for this constantly and over these decades, to actually bring forward the Eurasian land bridge at the time, the New Silk Road. That was the policy. It began as the productive triangle in Europe. It began as a commitment to advance the development of Poland, for example. And in that context, as you reference in your article, Renee, there were very brave figures who actually stood up to fight for this policy, for a shift away from the direction of world government, of this characteristic of this privatization of the world into a techno fascist paradise, but which of course is nothing other than collapse, destruction, genocide, and war. Away from that and towards the use of development corridors, the very specific concept communicated by LaRouche in his economics, of increasing the physical economic productivity of a band of territory that you're connecting to, across the world, but that this band of territory, this development corridor, LaRouche said these things don't cost anything. They pay for them. They don't cost anything. They create wealth. It's not even this banal idea of paying for themselves. That's not the issue. They create wealth. That you can create wealth through this policy of public credit for things like high-speed rail, nuclear power, agro-industrial complexes, lifting the whole platform of the economy to a higher level of capability to do the things that humanity needs to do. That's what we could have done at the turn of, the 1990s, at the end of the fall of the wall, which Lyndon LaRouche uniquely forecast. He said it would happen in 6 years, or 5 years, and happen in 6 years after his forecast. But I just want to raise that as the sort of counterpoint to everything that you're discussing, Renee, because the point is that
Good.
we didn't do that. The financier oligarchs grabbed the rein. They threw LaRouche in prison, which was a huge factor in all of this going the way that it did. And then we've come to the final point here where Putin is saying you're on our doorstep.
Yep. And this yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, if I may then too, because to get back to the article, which I also highly recommend people to subscribe to Executive Intelligence Review. The Reagan administration called it the best private intelligence agency out there. It still is today. But from reading this article,
that's not necessarily a good source of endorsement, Cade. Depends on who you
I think you should put it on the front of the magazine
people,
still.
The decent faction there.
Yeah. So with this idea of those Big Mac style privatizations coming from Rohatyn, it seems to me that your hypothesis in the article is through a kind of combination of the influence of Rohatyn and George Shultz, who was a key member in the Hoover Institution right on the Stanford campus, that they built this kind of atmosphere of computer science fetishization a bit. And it seems to me like these three avenues we're talking about, the military, healthcare, and city management, under the guise of this fetishization of data analysis to a certain degree, at least, where it was seen as a sort of panacea to all ills in conjunction with privatization, that Peter Thiel came about almost as less of his own personage than a kind of a cutout to sort of fulfill the destiny of what Rohatyn and Shultz were setting up, and where you even get a kind of confluence then of these three different money supply lines, as you were talking about in wars and healthcare and city management. It seems like Palantir is set up now to mismanage on all three fronts, like how you talk about their mismanagement.
Well, what they did is they ran a big attack on the patriots and the military. The reason that this kind of thing happened is because, as the United States has had, we don't anymore, but we had a certain lead at that point in the cyber tech world. And they really wanted to exploit that in order to keep their power, even though the structure of the industry was going through some major changes, and it wasn't clear whether it was going to work. And, there were all these mergers and acquisitions that Wall Street made a lot of money on, with Lockheed Martin and, and all these very big companies. In fact, Norman Augustine was also one of the people who became involved in this Silicon Valley thing, because they were looking over at Silicon Valley saying, okay, you've got to take the lead now in bringing in the technical material that's really going to make our new kind of military expenditures really jazzy, really worked better than anybody else. And this was one of the reasons that the United States got dragged into the war in Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia. This was the kind of thing that we're talking about was not done just in sandboxes. It was not just done in video games. It was done in real life wars that were continually breaking out, and bombing campaigns that the United States was being dragged into. Starting with Desert Storm, which George Bush Sr. was so nervous about these wars, which was probably a mild streak of either paranoia or goodness in him. It sounds funny, but some of his advisors were not the worst. Were not as evil as some of the people we've been treated to in recent times. And so Desert Storm was a 1-month war, but then very soon after, this war broke out in former Yugoslavia. By the mid-1990s, NATO and the United States were experimenting with all of these new weapon systems in these bombing campaigns around Yugoslavia, which was really horrifying. And there was bombings in Africa, in Sudan, and all kinds of crazy crap. Drone and experiments with the drones. Drones are very useful things, but they're when they're used the way they were used by Obama, it's really terrible. So you have this technological side that's being developed, and what they wanted to do was to use this also as a way of cleaning people like William Binney out of the government, because that's the other side of it. The reason they wanted to bounce the whole tech world aspect of this thing to a bunch of star-gazed college students who didn't know what the heck they were doing, and quickly turn them into billionaires so that they could be corrupted into going along with this Wall Street marriage with the military utopians. People like General Michael Hayden. I don't know whether people have taken the time to watch Oliver Stone's older movie about this called A Good American. I mean, have people heard of that? Do people know what I'm referring to?
I actually haven't heard of that either.
You've heard of that, or you haven't?
No, I haven't. I know a little Oliver Stone, but that's off my list a little bit.
No, this is a very good movie. It's about Binney. It's about William Binney, because what Binney was doing, who had been one of these responsible long-term employees, patriotic employees, sort of like the old New York City school teachers, these people who was working with the federal government with all the headaches that it gives you at that time to work with the federal government, because he was serious about getting a job done. And during the 1990s, because of the stuff that was going on in former Yugoslavia, because of the way that the Russian war with Afghanistan, Osama bin Laden was running around in Sudan and places like that. And there were indications of a new wave of terrorism emerging. He and his friends started doing some very, very serious work on how you monitor all these terrorist groups, half of which were in touch with George Soros. Let's not forget that, and British intelligence. How you monitor them in such a way that when they're about to go into an attack, and therefore you can catch them and you can stop them before they launch some kind of major attack. One of the U.S. embassies was bombed during the 1990s. I forget which one. I think it was in Africa. I apologize. I can't remember which country it was in. But there was a U.S. embassy that was bombed in Africa. So they were doing very serious work on this. And the movie is about the work he was doing and the fact that General Michael Hayden wanted to steal his program, but didn't want him to run it. They wanted to hand the program over to people that they controlled. And since Binney was not corruptible that way, they had a real fight. And what he explains, he's explained this at our events, it came down to the fact that he said to Hayden, General Hayden, who was the head of the NSA during the Clinton years, I can build this program for $300 million. And Hayden said, we're not interested. The program we want costs $2 billion. You get it? In other words, we want the federal government to spend a lot more money than you're going to make them spend. Then your competent program would be cheaper than the crap that I'm about to create. And that's the period where they started having these private companies banging on the doors of the National Security Agency saying, yeah, we'll offer you this, this program and that program. And that's the period that Peter Thiel came up with this idea that, that he and his friends had siphoned off enough smartasses from Stanford University that he could sell a securities company to the NSA. This is before 9/11.
Go on, excuse me. No,
and then what happened is when 9/11 occurred, that's when he finally sold PayPal to Meg Whitman for $1.5 billion. And with 50 million of that, I mean, they had a lot of debt to pay off and everything else, but with 50 million of that, that's how he created the seed capital for Palantir. And they were immediately taken under the wing of the CIA's, the Washington apparatus and In-Q-Tel. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was actually going to refer to that. I think that's this is very clear, the way that the CIA created, or it's, as you put it, took them under their wing. But they did all these, like you point out, that they gave them like practice assignments to make them ready to be hired and stuff like that.
Sure, I mean, which is not. I mean, that could be
of course
legitimate, but yes, they did. That's according to Stephen Cohn. I'm just quoting Stephen Cohn.
Right. And this, but I want to address something for the people who are listening. I mean, we're going to go to Q&A in about 10 minutes.
Oh, great.
And I was really provoked by the thing, by the section of your article that addresses the philosophical outlook of Thiel. Because basically, your argument is that, and it's pretty straightforward, that this is what they do, that the reason that the CIA grooms people like Thiel, as you said earlier, the reason that this, financier oligarchy, Synarchist network does that, or the way that they choose their targets, I'll put it that way, is on account of whether they are actually susceptible to this kind of fascist outlook. So what that is really represented by the role of Leo Strauss, the infamous professor at the University of Chicago, and who was actually an admirer of Carl Schmitt. So tell us, and I mean, like, what is this? What is it that they actually believe? Why is it that they act this way?
Well, I mean, when you're dealing with Carl Schmitt, you're dealing with the absolute inner core of the British connected apparatus that invented Adolf Hitler and constructed his dictatorship over a period of, far more, probably over a period of about 15 years, maybe 12 years or something like that. But that that Hitler, it's not as if Hitler came out of nowhere, and he certainly didn't come out of, quote unquote, the German population. In fact, he wasn't even German; he was Austrian. He was shipped into Germany to run this escapade, and Schmitt was Carl Schmitt was an infamous jurist. He was a leading judicial authority in Germany, who was the person who approved Hitler's declaration of the emergency law after the terrorist attack, after the burning down of the German parliament in late February 1933. Roosevelt was elected in 1932. He was about to be inaugurated in March. In those days, the president was inaugurated in March, not in January. And Roosevelt was about to be inaugurated in March. There was an assassination attempt against Roosevelt, which people may or may not know about. It's not usually talked about, but we reminded people of that when he was was sitting next to the mayor of Chicago, I believe in Florida, if I'm not mistaken. Is that right, Daniel? Am I remembering right? The shootout. Anyway.
I don't recall, actually.
Oh, okay, yeah, but in any event, but Roosevelt was about to become president in March of 1933.
No, that was in Chicago.
It was in Chicago, yeah.
Yeah, because his mayor of Chicago was shot was sitting next to him.
Right. Yeah. For some reason. Okay. I'll take your word for it. I can't quite remember the location, but I know the mayor of Chicago was sitting next to him. And in this interim period of instability, because here you had a breakdown of the world banking system, it was a period of tremendous chaos. In this period, Adolf Hitler was appointed, not elected, appointed von Hindenburg to be the chancellor. And then before Roosevelt was inaugurated, this incident occurred where a madman was allowed to go into the Parliament building, start a fire, burn the Reichstag down. And then Hitler passed a bill called the Notverordnung, which was the emergency laws. And Schmidt was the jurist who said that this was legal. But it wasn't just something that he said out of nowhere. He developed a whole philosophy and theory to defend this, what he called the Führerprinzip, the principle of the Führer, the principle of the leader in a time of emergency, and endowed this post through his judgments, endowed this post the absolute right to put aside any constitutional principles and to do anything to save the people. You know, that he was endowed with the power to save the people. And this has been the model for brutal dictatorship ever since, and the whole movement. And there were other kinds of movements in Germany. There were other political circles who were attempting to earlier and continuing to attempt to get to get Germany and the United States in more of a dialogue about how to deal with the awful, stupid outcome of World War I. And within a year, Hitler had them assassinated. You know, people like the general von Schleicher, who briefly had been chancellor himself and was generally recognized as a patriotic and decent person, but who had come from the German military. He was murdered a year later. So he was just wiping out anybody who was identified as being against this Führerprinzip that Schmidt represented. Now, you think that a jurist who gave permission and legitimacy in the eyes of the world to Hitler's declaration of absolute dictatorship, that a jurist who had done that would have been considered kind of like off limits as somebody acceptable to academia in the United States. Well, after World War II, Leo Strauss, who was an admirer of his, was allowed to flourish at the University of Chicago along with his friend Milton Friedman, who were and then George Shultz, by the way, was studying with Milton Friedman in this period of time, and to promote the idea that there was legitimacy to Schmidt's way of thinking. But of course, they kept that quiet. I mean, he developed his own arc of ideas about this, but it was known. It wasn't a secret that he considered Schmidt's rulings in this regard to be legitimate. And this is why in January of 2001, when the courts in the United States decided that George Bush Jr. had won the election, when the Supreme Court decided that they were going to rule in favor of George Bush Jr. having won the election against Gore. Not that Gore would have been any better. It's possible Gore would have been even worse. I mean, it was a terrible election. And LaRouche had actually put forward a completely different solution to the problem, which are people are.
Suddenly we can't hear you. Renee, are you there? Renee, we can't hear you right now. Okay, I am going to ask her to reboot, to re-enter. Oh,
Yeah,
are
I
you
sent
there?
her a text too, so hopefully we'll get this settled shortly.
Okay.
But I have a couple more thoughts to develop what's in this article a little bit further. I just want to emphasize that what we're seeing here with especially when Renee brought up William Binney, who is was a member of the veteran, right now helped, I think, co-found the Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity group with Ray McGovern. So former lead guy in the NSA had his own program set up in order to predict the kind of attacks like 9/11 without the kind of invasive data collection that Palantir and everything kind of post 9/11 through the Patriot Act that revealed by either by Assange or Edward Snowden, that you didn't need that level of personal invasion to actually effectively stop these attacks. But I think what you see with a lot of what Renee was talking about and goes into the article, because of how this, synarchistic kind of money slush fund collecting that comes about in the wake of the destruction of the physical economy, the point isn't to do your job well. The point is more the opposite. To do your job well in the eyes of the synarchistic tradition, how I see it at least, is to not do your job well. Compared to what William Binney did, so it's better.
Yeah,
to
well,
have, go ahead.
I got to talk to Bill a number of times during my Senate campaign, and he's his point was also that Hayden also, not only did he do that as part of this grabbing up of income streams, absolutely, but also they wanted to be able to spy on everyone and have have the ability to blackmail everyone that they could possibly want. Renee's back on. Renee, are you there?
Sorry about that. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, great. Anyway, I guess I got blocked out when I was talking about Hitler. Such an unpleasant subject, huh?
No, but it was good. You got to the point where you were talking about Leo Strauss with Milton Friedman, flourishing at University of Chicago.
Right. And I was just saying that this is what Lynn talked about in January 2001, January 4th, 2001, that he said that this story is very well known, what I'm going through about how Hitler to power, and that there are a group of people in the United States who were gonna push for some kind of Reichstag fire. They were going to organize some kind of Reichstag fire in order to try to do with the Bush cabinet what they had done with Hitler, which is to give them absolute power. And Lynn said that in January 2001, 9 months, before the 9/11 attack. Because he really knew this history, and he knew that what happened in Germany was a reflection of the power and influence of this synarchist crowd. And I didn't go through that in the article, but we've documented this many times. That if you know the way these people behave, it's like a loop that they keep repeating the same scenario again and again. And it's time that we get sick of it, and that we just don't allow people of this caliber to have this characteristic to be in influential positions in government. Doesn't mean we have to, but it means that we need to make sure that people who serve in government represent a higher level, a different standpoint. And that is really the challenge of this period. And that's why Thiel is so dangerous, because we don't know down to the detail all the things that Palantir really does with and for the military industrial complex. We don't know it down to the nitty gritty, but it's very scary to think of people who have this kind of mentality, this Straussian mentality enhanced by this really peculiar, silly, I hate to use the word philosophical, pseudo-philosophical.
Philistinical.
Obsession with imitation as being the determining characteristic of human behavior. This silly stuff, this silly mechanical stuff that they come up with, which is just a newfangled version of the same old stupid British empiricism that we fought the American Revolution against. That instead of people, working their way through the mindset, the philosophical principles of truthfulness, which enabled the American Revolution to have these positive qualities, people get sucked into debating these silly ideas with these silly assertions, I should say. They're not really ideas, they're just assertions, which have no grounding in reality. And this is the reason that, Peter Thiel reminds me of Aldous Huxley's obsession with something called neoteny. Actually, it was Julian Huxley, his brother, who got deeply involved in studying animals who a phenomenon among certain animals, like chickens and snakes and stuff like that, where you'll find in a collection in a herd of these animals, you'll find one member of the grouping, which is an adult. It's a fully grown adult, but it still has infant feathers or infant hair or infant physical characteristics. And he was mesmerized by this. He was always studying this. And I think that his preoccupation with this has to do with the way that they have poisoned the culture. The way that this Huxley, Aleister Crowley movement in British intelligence has poisoned the culture to encourage people to never really become actual adults. And that's the image that comes up in my mind when I think of Peter Thiel, that he's like an overgrown 13-year-old. He achieved a great accomplishment when he was 13 years old. He became one of the leading chess champions in the world. He became one of America's absolutely leading child chess champions. And he never really grew up past that point. You can tell just by looking at the way he acts when he's being interviewed. And I think they ferreted him out when he was at, he sort of distinguished himself by setting up the Standard Review as a conservative newspaper at this liberal campus in Stanford, and kind of gained a certain kind of notoriety, but was groomed by this circle around Renee Girard and these people whose philosophy he found very appealing, whose meanderings he found very appealing, because he lives in a fantasy world. He's just living in a childhood fantasy world where he's competing in chess, or he's competing for business, or he's all of his companies are named after words and characters that come out of the the Tolkien Lord of the Rings. And he's just yeah, right. And Lord, is that did I say it wrong? Is it Lord of the Ring or something like that? I forget.
Lord of the Rings. Yeah.
No, all those names: Mithril, Andruil, Palantir. They're all words that come out of which he said he had fully memorized the entire Lord of the Rings when he was about 14, and he was always playing Dungeons and Dragons. I mean, the guy's not in the real world, and they said, "Oh, this is our perfect repository for gathering these youth, who are very talented in some of these computer functions, and creating our own group of captive zombies who can do this kind of work, but are not going to give us the kind of trouble that a William Binney or somebody who's really patriotic." I mean, I'm not saying it just has to be old people like William Binney. Of course, he wasn't that old when he quit the NSA. But the point is that he had life experience and he had a moral streak in him, which is why he was working for the government. And we could create people like that. And we don't have to have these zombies, run our cyber technical world. And it's very dangerous, actually, because these are very powerful. These are very powerful industrial applications. They're micro applications, but they're very powerful. And we really should, not allow this to be going on. And privatization is what clogged up the whole process, so that the wrong kind of people could get under control, get into control, and it's very dangerous.
I really thank you for this so far, Renee. It's been very good, and right now it's time to turn to questions. I think it's a good time to open that up. So anyone who would like to raise a question, please do so, and request to do so, and then we'll bring you in. Go right ahead, GJ.
So first of all, thank you for this conversation. It's very refreshing.
I can't hear him.
Oh, shucks. Can't hear me at all? Can anybody hear me?
We can hear you, but you're fuzzy. Renee may be having more trouble than
I
us.
can hear him at all. Yeah, I'd love
Are
to
you on?
hear him.
Are you on? Yeah, if you can pull it up to your ear, like you're talking on the phone without a speakerphone.
Okay. Is that a little bit better? Can you hear me okay? Just checking. No?
Renee, can you hear him? I can hear him.
No, I can't. How
Really?
frustrating. Yeah, it's not coming through at all.
Okay, so go ahead and ask your question, and I'll restate it to Renee.
Okay. Well, first, a big thank you. And then second of all, I guess my questions are, I know that Peter Thiel is regular attendee of Bilderberg, and by regular, I mean decades. He has even been listed as one of the chairmen of Bilderberg, founded in 1953. It went dark 66 years of existence in 2019. And their agendas, although vague, speak to this globalist agenda that is being discussed here. I also know, that IQT, InQtel's CEO, we all know that they're CIA, but the CEO is on various YouTubes bragging about how InQtel is perhaps the main reason that Palantir even financially exists because of their investments. So I guess just my question for some commentary on this is some commentary on the Bilderbergers, Bilderberg meetings, those attendees, the head of which has always been AXA Insurance, the largest insurance company in the world, Henri Castries, who's moved on to chair Institut Montaigne now. So I guess just if you can convey to her, I'm just curious to her comments on the Bilderberg meetings and Peter Thiel and that group there, in terms of how this data collection that Palantir is doing for the vaccine passports, that's well in the news, that's even on Palantir's website, and we all know.
Can you say what he's saying?
Yeah, excuse me. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
It's really strange that you can't hear him, Renee. We'll have to figure that out another time. But he is raising primarily the question of he said that that Peter Thiel has been going to Bilderberg meetings for decades, and that this is a policy of oligarchical, corporation, and massive corporations and so forth, and that he raised the question of InQT or InQtel, I guess InQtel, which you mentioned in your article, as well as he pointed out that Palantir has been given a contract to collect vaccine data for the government. So this is sort of, I think he's giving more, or his view of some additional context for what Thiel is up to. What do you want to say to that, Renee?
Yeah.
No, I that's very useful. Absolutely. Yeah, the Bilderberg connection, I think, is very interesting. There's this picture of Alex Karp. We haven't talked about Alex Karp, who's an extension of the Frankfurt School. His claim to fame is that he, in the 1990s, while Thiel was still hanging out at Stanford, that he took off to Germany and studied to become an official progressive with Jürgen Habermas at the Frankfurt School. And they're doing a lot of stuff in Europe. They're doing a lot of stuff in Germany. I think that's one of the reasons Helga's ears were, picked up about this. Recently, the former prime minister of Austria, who was thrown out in a crazy money scandal, but actually it wasn't even, I guess it was a money scandal. He resigned as prime minister of Austria, and now he's going to be an employee of Thiel Capital, one of the one of the investment funds that Thiel owns. They're very active there, and obviously the Bilderberg connection is very interesting. There's a famous picture of Karp getting out of a limousine, and the doors being opened by some guy with one of these typical British workers open, with the tall hat and the special suit, opening the door for him. And Thiel is coming, not Thiel, Karp is coming flying out of the limousine, in his usual uniform, which is what's it called? Not ski. long country. What's it called again, Daniel? When you're skiing across the surface, you're not skiing. You're not
Cross-country skiing.
Cross-country skiing outfit.
Ah, yes.
Yeah, and with unshaven, looking like he just fell off fell out of a gymnasium or something like that, and this butler is opening the door for him. And it was at the reason I'm mentioning it is that it was taken at a Bilderberg meeting. It's been in newspapers all over the world. So yes, those connections are giving them a certain kind of prestige and an entree to certain high-level political circles, and it's very nasty. Karp is really I call him the Mad Hatter.
Thank you very much, GJ, for raising those points. Do you want to make any other short comment?
Oh, yeah, I guess just one other little short comment is there are many of us that are aware that a globalist goal is to microchip us all. This has been known since the 1960s, 1969.
I think I'm back on if I was dropped off.
Oh, well,
okay, good.
Go ahead.
So the comment, I guess the follow-up comment is just being aware of this globalist agenda to microchip us all. So
Renee, hold on, and he's speaking. I'll repeat it back to you.
So just being aware of this globalist goal to microchip us all, the same way that they legally now microchip all cattle, and if you have a pet, you have to microchip your pet. So they're just being aware of this globalist goal to microchip us, and I do believe it's before 2030. I'm just curious as to her comment as to what other information that she has. I know there's a lot of stuff that goes back before Bilderberg. We're talking about Hitler and so forth. I guess following up now up to the more present time, the 90s and the 2000s. What are perhaps, I don't know if there's a solution to stop it, but just something that we can all be publicly aware of, because it's often shamed. We're often shamed. People say, oh, they're not going to microchip us. They're not going to sneak a chip in us. But they have been talking about this for a very long time. And now that Palantir is collecting all the data, another company is called Entrust.com, and that is owned by the Quant family, who were tried at Nuremberg but escaped and are related to Goebbels. Entrust.com is the UK vaccine passport. They also collect for the Canada, and they also do military stuff for US, but they're collecting over there, and then Palantir is collecting over here. They're going to be using that all data to fold into our digital citizen wallets, which is something else that's coming out from the bankers. I'm just wondering if they can just comment on this, the broader theme of surveillance folds into the microchipping us.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that you had a little bit in there where you were hoping for a solution, and
I know that it would be nice, right?
that's what we've been fighting for. That's what the LaRouche organization is committed to: is to defeat the policy of depopulation run by the oligarchy. And the way that we're going to do that is that we're going to revive a republic. We're going to revive, and I'm sorry, what I mean to say is we actually have a strategy to accomplish this, which I invite you to learn about tomorrow as we're discussing the danger of World War III, because that's where we've come to on this unraveling of the system. And we've come to that crisis, but it need not go that way, because right now Russia and China are collaborating, Iran increasingly, just signed this major 20-year strategic agreement with Russia, and the policy that they have is the shared community of a community of destiny for mankind, a community of shared destiny for mankind. That's a mouthful, but the idea of actually spreading physical economic development across the entire world, and this is going to be this is the crucial transformation that we have to make. But let me share with Renee what you said. He raised the issue, the question of microchipping, the idea that there's a globalist policy of inserting microchips into human beings, which has been done in the case of livestock, for example, which is absolutely the case. I had a conversation during my Senate campaign during with a woman, Nicole Frang, at the Kansas Cattlemen Association, where she talked about this. And it is part of a policy of reducing agricultural output, of reducing livestock, as under the guise of a green policy. Oh, this is sustainability and so forth. That is what it is. So he raises a matter of microchipping, the role that Palantir may play in this, given the fact that they're and he referenced some details that I don't have right now off the top of my head, but that they have in data gathering here, the other operations taking place in the UK. What should we do? But the thing I wanted to say to him was, he was quite unsure about whether there's a solution concept that's possible. So please go ahead, Renee. And then we have another question after that.
Well, I think we just have to be confident that we can arouse the kind of social, political backlash against this war policy. That means that people of this type are not going to be in control. I mean, people can overreact on these questions of, what are the purpose of such microchips and stuff like that. And I'm sure there definitely are sinister intents governing some of these people. Am I coming across, by the way? Can you hear me?
Yes, it's come through.
Oh, okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
It's a little bit confusing
fine.
sometimes, but okay, great. But I think the real point is that by mobilizing people to stop this drive towards thermonuclear confrontation, I think the side benefit will be that we'll finally be able to get these kinds of idiots out of control of the most essential activities of humanity, including things like education. I mean, that's why with the work that we do on this question of education, and that's why our defense of the educational systems and so forth is so important. You just need to develop more people. That's why I brought up this question of the feistiness that I ran into a Monday night among these people living in Woodside, Queens. They're very, very ordinary people, but they're ready to take on the whole city government. And when they realized that they could actually use this to take on the entire country, they were very excited. They didn't shrink. They rose. They said, "This is what we've got to do." They're ready for a fight. It's a wonderful quality in Americans that we rally and unite around. And if we do this and can join with people in other parts of the world to say we've had enough of this war danger, these problems we'll be able to solve this kind of problem. And also educating people about what does it mean to have ideas? What is a real idea?
Thank
So
you.
Yeah.
No, thank you for that very clear answer. Cade, do you want to say something? Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add real quickly too, and I think something to be thinking about here with what GJ was brought up. I think it's a higher perspective to look at this too, where we're talking about, you needed the shelving of Bill Binney's solution in order for the Patriot Act to come in, and to me it seems like the increased restrictions and surveillance capacities and infringements that's being talked about here seem always dependent upon the shelving of the actual solution to a problem when it comes up. And I think that's part of our job here is, like Renee was saying, get people aware of when you have an actual solution concept, when there's an actual idea that has a potential efficacy, make that well known, make that the demanded solution to the situation and not something set up to fail.
Renee,
Yeah.
can you...
Yeah, they're trying to get very exotic in the kinds of methods that they're using to create dictatorship, but I don't think it's going to work. I mean, if these kinds of people remain in control of policy making, we probably will end up with a thermonuclear war. So then that'll solve all our problems. I hate to put it that way, but in other words, they will never really succeed. That's one of the lessons of Nazi Germany. I mean, Hitler got nowhere. I mean, all he could do was destroy. He could not actually create anything. And that's the general characteristic of their system. They drive us from bankruptcy to bankruptcy. How did people like Rohatyn, Schultz become so influential? Through a whole series of breakdowns of the financial system. We had a breakdown in 1980 when Reagan was first coming in and Paul Volcker raised the interest rates, to 20%. It really exploded in 1987, exploded again in 1996, where there was a complete breakdown around, where long-term capital management nearly took down the entire financial system. It broke again in 07, 08. We're in a new phase of the financial breakdown. They don't really create anything that can last. They go from bungling crisis to crisis. And their system will not hold together eternally. There are many ways that this can lead to an apocalyptic kind of breakdown of civilization as a whole. Thank God for what the Chinese and the Russians are doing right now. They have become the defenders of the future of mankind. Sometimes it's hard for Americans to accept that, but in actuality, that's occurring. That's one of the reasons I think it's really worth looking at this Pine article, because he is a man who is a specialist in apocalyptic problems. He's worked on this EMP question, for decades. This is really one of the most awful things that can happen to the planet and to our country. But he didn't shrink into a terrified quivering mass of flesh looking at this. He's worked this, he's been fighting this through, and now he's echoing a lot of our ideas on how we can create a new kind of strategic architecture based on trust, or what Helga calls the restoration of a Westphalian principle for the relations between nations. The Treaty of Westphalia was the great treaty in 1648 to 52 that ended the so-called 30 Years' War, which was really a 150 years war, and caused nations to respect each other's sovereignty. And it was based on this idea that if you want to get along with other countries, you also have to always be willing to respond to their strategic needs and interests. You have to be willing to make compromises. You have to be willing to work with the other. And that's the kind of approach to international relations. But economics, the foundation for a strong relationship of trust, is economic development. But LaRouche used to quote, it was actually the Pope during John Kennedy's era, Pope Paul VI, who coined this very meaningful phrase where he said, the new name for peace is economic development. And that makes a lot of sense. And that's the way we've got to think. And by getting that out, we can really drive these people into, they can play with their tiddlywinks in their own basement, but they don't have to run the world.
I really appreciate that answer, Renee. The way that you approached this whole discussion, but especially this last comment that you've been making. Thank you. We have another person requesting to speak. This is Anthony. And I looked at your timeline, Anthony, so I know that you recently read Treason in America by Anton Chaikin, excuse me. But go ahead. Please make your comment, ask your question.
Hello. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah, I'm clear.
Okay, great. Well, first, yeah, thanks for doing this. These types of conversations are very important and useful. But yeah, so during this conversation and in the article, I found really interesting, also funny, the bits about Thiel's love of Lord of the Rings and what that might, indicate about his, I don't know what you want to call it, level of intellectual development, et cetera, right? I mean, I grew up reading Lord of the Rings too a bunch of times. I don't think I would name every single one of my companies after it, right? But it was an interesting detail in the picture that I have of him, because before that, I was thinking, I mean, I thought the Lord of the Rings stuff was a little weird, sure, whatever, but before that, I was kind of thinking of him as one of the ringleaders of like a new upstart group, a relatively new upstart group of elites, right? And that's a very compelling way to view and understand history, right? Is through the lens of competition between different elite factions, right? Yankee Cowboy War, et cetera, et cetera. But what I'm getting from this conversation from the article is that he's like I think someone said he's like an overgrown 13-year-old boy being put forward by someone else. You know, of course, there's In-Q-Tel and the CIA. We know that. But who is it? Is it, as we know from things like, you know, Treason in America, et cetera, like these groups of, you know, these intelligence groups are often made up of families. Is it just the same sort of cast of characters that we're used to, the Bushes, right? Are they behind this organization that is now putting forth someone like Thiel because they believe he's a good enough you know, like a sufficiently malleable person, and or you know, yeah, I guess, you know, so I don't ramble too much. What is the deal there?
Thank you. I am praying that you can hear him, Renee.
No, I couldn't. I was trying to figure out if there's some button I can push. Can you hear me now? I took out the earbuds. I thought maybe that might be contributing to the problem, or maybe the fact that you hit I think I may be channeled through your phone or something. I don't know. Anyway.
No, and we'll figure it out later. I don't know what's going on, but
yeah.
Anyway, it was a very thoughtful question from Anthony, where he he posed. Feel free to correct me, Anthony, if I get this wrong. I wasn't quite ready to repeat it, but he posed the question of what is. He began with an assumption before reading the article, or he was considering the possibility that what Thiel represents is a new wave of elites, and that what we're looking, and he's going to take part in the sort of an idea of elites versus elites as a like sort of a next phase of era in our or in present history, so to speak. The next set of elites. Here's the typification of it, Peter Thiel. But that when he read your article, he changed he understands that you have a different view of this, a different hypothesis of him as an overgrown 13-year-old boy, and that yes, clearly there's the input of the CIA. There's other inputs into who Thiel has become, but who, if he's being put forward to advance a certain policy, who is he being put forward by? And he raised the treason in America and said, well, is it, you know, he said, I know that in the past it's often families that are part of this, that have sort of are themselves organs of intelligence services, or represent represent the intelligence services. What is it today? What is it that's behind Thiel?
Yeah, well, you know, that's why I put up this question of classical tragedy as opposed to soap opera. You know, because this idea that they can sell these billionaires who become billionaires overnight, which is really suspicious if you think about it. It mainly has to do with the fact that there's these professors, you know, people like David Shaw and others who have trained their students on how to become super wealthy while playing with money. You see, they don't really he didn't make the money from PayPal. PayPal was losing money the entire time. He made the money from creating Thiel Capital. And they were just playing the hedge fund market. And they learn how to leverage on the hedge fund market, which is that you're becoming wealthy on the basis of stealing from everybody else who's got to survive. I mean, it's really look at the hyperinflation that's been created by this hedge fund market. And the only reason that it works is that people will keep accepting the US dollar because we have so many nuclear weapons, not because of what we're producing. So, you know, you had people who just, you know, threw to abandon their morality and got into this hedge fund stuff. He actually had Karp running it for him. Apparently he wasn't very good at speculating. It's one of the points that Max Chafkin makes in his biography, that whenever he tried to actually run one of these business deals, it usually fell flat and busted. But that's why he brought Karp in, because Karp is some kind of really, I don't know, some kind of real manipulator how to do this. The second investment firm that Thiel created this is very, very weird. What happened is that not only was he not running it, but two guys from Skadden Arps, two financial attorneys from Skadden Arps, quickly volunteered to be the heads of I think it's the one that's called Clarion, which he created in 2007, because they weren't really making any money initially on Palantir. Now, Skadden Arps is a very, very high-level enemy of law firm. I mean, they've done all these dirty tricks for the Democratic Party. We had a number of very big showdowns with them. Some people call them the favorite law firm of the B'nai B'rith Anti-Defamation League, which is AIPAC. It's big Zionist lobby apparatus, in the U.S. Congress. So they handle a lot of legal cases for the Democratic Party. And these two guys who were runaways from that immediately volunteered to run his second investment house. So this is a guy who's just learned how to play the game and has other people around him who's helping him to play the game. So it has all the stench of this David Shaw, they have Division, who was a big professor at Columbia University training his students on how to do this. There was another guy at Stanford, I forget his name, who was the big trainer in the company of the people in computer sciences, how to become a billionaire overnight. And the major universities in our country are competing with each other on who's produced more billionaires overnight. And you got to stop and think, if somebody's a fast money billionaire, you know that there's something morally wrong with them, because they are stealing. This is being financed by lowering teachers' wages, by bankrupting municipalities, by making sure that we do not solve the problem of contaminated dirty water systems now that are in cities all over the United States. This is the shutdown of municipal investment in infrastructure. That's how these hedge funds make their money, is by stealing from the future. So if somebody says to you, I'm a billionaire, you better stand back and wash your hands, before you go near them, because it's a really dirty, filthy business. Now, is Thiel really a philosophical mind? Look, I read his article called this item that he wrote in 2007, which was a reflection on this conference that he held with Hamilton Kelly and Renee Girard in 2004. I read the article. Anybody can read it. I think I put the link up. You can go read it yourself, called The Straussian Moment. And it's complete blither. To develop a sense of how you can judge somebody's philosophical argument, you need to know a few things about history. You need to understand Leibniz's concept of analysis situs. You have to be able to situate these things in there. You have to know how to situate something in its proper environment. And then right in the beginning of this article called The Straussian Moment, he says that the American Revolution was based on the ideas of John Locke. Well, that's one of the biggest British lies of the last 300 years, and it's a total lie. Never happened. John Locke was an enemy of the American Revolution. He was never the basis for the American Revolution. The critical document that refuted Locke was Leibniz's document, Essays on a New Understanding. And it was Leibniz's influence, not Locke's influence, Leibniz's influence, which led to the American Revolution. And Locke represented the worst aspects of British empiricism, which is the argument. I hate to use the word philosophy. It's this horrendous argument, based on, to some extent, Aristotle, but on even lower level than Aristotle, arguing that we know the universe through our senses, that the only knowledge that we can gain of the physical universe is based on our sensory apparatus. Humanity has never mastered the physical universe on the basis of the sensory apparatus. The humanity has mastered the physical universe and is constantly in a struggle to do so through the correction of the inaccuracies of sensory perception by the ability of the human mind to conceptualize, to create valid hypotheses. It is the use of the gift of human creativity which allows us to develop valid knowledge about the physical universe, which was key in the American Revolution, because the real issue of the American Revolution was the fight over economic development. And the standard bearer in this was the people who were influenced by the writings of Leibniz, who was the great genius and reviver of the Renaissance in the period after the Treaty of Westphalia. He was born right around the time that the Treaty of Westphalia was signed. He was, although he was a German Protestant, he was educated in Catholic France, where the impulse for the Treaty of Westphalia was the strongest. And he's the person who revived the work of Nicholas of Cusa, of Kepler, and developed the alternative to the Aristotelian mechanics, which had been such a limit on mankind's ability to develop new concepts of power, of the use of power to improve mankind's condition. And Leibniz is the one who coined the term, the use of the word power, to refer to discoveries like the invention of the steam engine. And this had a very big effect on the circles that educated Benjamin Franklin. His writings on this came into Pennsylvania and also into Massachusetts through various circles that were very interested in cultivating relations with the American colonies. Graham Lowry, our associate who's now deceased, whose family went all the way back to the American Revolution, wrote a fantastic book about this called I'm one step ahead of myself. Daniel, you must remember the title of the book.
As he saw it?
No, Graham Lowry's book.
I'm sorry, what am I doing? How the Nation Was Won.
How the Nation Was Won. Thank you very much. Graham's book on this is absolutely fantastic. It is the only, it's a real breakthrough in historiography about America. It is the only patient account of the development of the faction around Benjamin Franklin, which gives due credit to the influence of Leibniz's ideas, which was very, very profound. A very, very big effect on the people around Benjamin Franklin and the circles, which expanded to actually many of the colonies. But in the Massachusetts situation and then the Pennsylvania situation, it was key. I recommend that book to absolutely everybody. It will restore your American patriotism even under these awful conditions, the right kind of patriotism. And yeah.
And thank you for your response, Renee. And I think from that response, it's becoming more apparent how Thiel's economic, philosophical, and historical acumen, might not be enough to boil water. But to further Anthony's question a little bit more, I'm thinking some of what he's saying, and like in the Chaikin book, and even in No Limits to Growth, there's certain sections where Lynn talks about, I think the Morgan and the Harriman families, and then even the Perkins syndicate in New England. And it seemed like it was these sorts of syndicates and collections of families that would set up the type of people like Thiel that would acquire through one way or another the at least appearance of this influence. And I'm wondering, is this something we know right now? Is it a different set of families? Is it a different kind of structure? Is it more depersonalized?
Well, I think this Gerard Hamilton Kelly connection says it all. I mean, he fell in with this crowd. He got there probably was a reason that he was very susceptible to being drawn to them, because Hamilton Kelly, who was Gerard's friend at Stanford, was the chaplain there. Who he retired just about the time that Thiel came in as a student, but he hung around the campus and he was known. And Hamilton Kelly was born and lived for many years in South Africa. And Thiel has a sentimental relationship to the worst aspects of South Africa. He completely freaked out his fellow students by defending apartheid. I mean, you really have to be a jerk to defend apartheid. And during the 1980s, it was common on campuses for there to be demonstrations against apartheid in South Africa to support Mandela, and that kind of thing. And he opposed this. And he really scared. There were people at the campus who were really frightened about this. And while it sort of indicated that the guy needed some counseling, but he had an emotional connection about this, probably because he went to school there because his father worked in a mine in Namibia, and he was sent to British, private schools, in the British and German private schools in the area. And he never grew up to the point of working through how whatever his personal experience was, it was not a valid basis for making a judgment about the situation. In fact, when one of the students challenged him, this is a woman who went public with this when Thiel became a billionaire. Actually, Chafkin interviewed her. He looked her up. This woman, she has a complicated name. Her father was a doctor in Africa, and her mother was British. And she's got a podcast about child rearing and stuff like that. People can, if you look in the Chafkin book, you can get her name. But she was so upset when she was at Stanford University about his reaction to these, the very ordinary kind of student protests against apartheid that were going on, that she went to talk to him. She said, the idea that somebody in my dormitory thought that apartheid was good scared the daylights out of me. So she went to talk to him, and he just sort of looked at her and she's African American. And she just said, why would you defend this? And he just said, oh, you don't understand. According to her report, he said something like, well, you don't understand. It works in South Africa, and we shouldn't make any judgment about it. And he wouldn't discuss it with her. And she was really terrified by this. She said she found him a terrifying person, and that when he became a billionaire, she knew that some of her old friends from Stanford who had gone through the same kind of fear reaction that she had, when they realized that he was a billionaire, they were terrified to speak out about this. They felt that he would take revenge. That was their feeling about it. So she was the only one in the student body who persisted in repeating the story. But and Chafkin put it out, and I think it's worthy. I think the Chafkin book is a valuable book. I think people, it's not that well written. He probably was under a lot of pressure to get it done fast, and it probably needed a few editings. It's a little bit all over the place, and sometimes you can't quite figure out the point he's making, and it jumps around a lot, which I can appreciate because of the nature of the subject. But if you can get a library version of it, so you don't have to spend a lot of money on it or something. It's worth checking into. But I think the job that he does on the early development of Thiel is right on. I mean, I don't think it really needs to be. The problem is not whether he had certain emotional problems when he got to college. The problem is, why did they make those emotional problems worse rather than better? And a lot of these universities, that's a problem. There's a lot of psychological profiling goes on at universities, looking for the student who can be molded into a certain kind of social fabric. And I think at Stanford, this is massive. That's what I think. So his problem got worse when he was there. And I think he was attracted to Hamilton Kelly because of the South African connection. So he got mesmerized by Renee Girard, who was the friend of Kelly's. And these people are insane. I mean, their epistemology is nuts. They say that the human mind is based. It's like, you ever hear the expression "monkey see, monkey do"? They say the human mind is based on imitation, and that's why you can't stop humans from committing violence, because violence is so much a part of our recorded history in our individual religions and in our nations that we're violent by nature. Now, that's a pretty stupid argument, if you ask me.
At this point, Anthony, we definitely need to talk some more, and I want to invite you to the next time that we have a space. I'll make sure to let you know about it. But I want to see, since we're going to end right at 11, it seems to me we should try to get in one more question if anyone has one. And if not, then we can hear from Anthony again if you have anything further to say. And then we'll close out. And at this point, if people are considering what they might comment on or question, please, just request to speak or do one of the reactions. But I do want to I want to share with people a few things real quick. One of them is that you can see in terms of my featured tweets at the top, of course, a link in the first one on the far right to Renee's article that you can read for free. It's in this week's Executive Intelligence Review magazine. You can get a subscription to that. We just every Thursday a new issue comes out. Just came out yesterday. In addition, you'll see in the middle there I have a link to the RSVP for tomorrow's International Schiller Institute Dialogue, which will feature a keynote from Helga Zepp-LaRouche and include Harley Schlanger and Paul Gallagher, who's a co-editor of Executive Intelligence Review. And you can read Harley's material on our website, the LaRouche Organization website, theLaRouche.org, or these other LaRoucheOrganization.com, the way to get to it. And we're also going to have a high-level diplomat speaking from a significant country to discuss the danger of war between the United States and Russia, thermonuclear annihilation war, which is what is being threatened at the moment. So please look at those. And finally, if you appreciate what Renee is doing and you realize that she's been doing this for 50 years, I want to share with you an inside perspective, which is that Renee is one of the most committed fundraisers of the LaRouche movement in its history. And she has done miracles to make sure that this organization has the funds that it needs to do the crucial work that it's doing. So I want to invite you to please become a member of the Schiller Institute by making a recurring contribution. If $5 is what you want to do a month, then do it. If you can do more, please do. But if you do that, then you also get our quarterly magazine, which has just been launched, which is actually this past year. The fall issue just came out. It's called the Leonora, and it's sort of it comes after the Fidelia, which some of you may be familiar with, but it's the present day version. So please become a member of the Schiller Institute, make a contribution by using the link that's in the second tweet that I have featured at the top. Okay, so with that out of the way, we have Jim would like to make a comment. And so Anthony, let's talk again soon. And but I'm gonna bring in Jim instead at the moment. Thank you so much, Anthony. Okay, here we go. Hi, good night, Jim. How are you? Good evening.
I'm doing well, thanks.
Great. Go right ahead.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you could comment some on what Synarchism is.
Great question. He asked, Renee, can you hear me now?
Yeah, sure.
He said he wanted to ask if you could comment more on what Synarchism is.
Synarchism is the name of the alliance that was assembled around the time of the Treaty of Versailles after World War I by a group of financiers, according to the people who investigated this, which is the patriotic circle around General Donovan, who worked with Franklin Roosevelt to create the precursor to the CIA, which was called the OSS. They did a big investigation of this, and during the Ronald Reagan years, Mr. LaRouche was contacted at a certain point by people around William Casey who said, look, we've just declassified the World War II documents that that were assembled by Donovan's investigation of how Hitler and other dictatorships came to power after World War I. And the only people we know who can make any sense of these documents is your staff. So we're inviting you to go through them. I understand Pierre Baudry has been doing a lot of research about this continuing. He was a part, because he's French speaking, he was invited right from the beginning to help go through these documents. And they were doing this. They were going through documents that that pertained to a circle of financiers gathered around Banque Worms. That's the French pronunciation. Worms is WORMS, and led to a network throughout Europe of top financial houses that were financing all of the different kind of radical movements that were exploding after World War I because of the miserable economic conditions that erupted in that period in every European country. So they were giving money to the communists, they were giving money to the fascists, they were helping to create these movements if they didn't already existed, and basically going for a kind of radicalization to see how they could push this to redrawing the political map of Europe. And the files that we went through when our people were invited to go through these files, the files which were handwritten, this is before computers existed, the files that our people were invited to go through were labeled, interestingly, Synarchism, Nazi/communism, Nazi communism. In other words, the research and investigations were based on the starting assumption, forget about this thing of left versus right. Rather, what we're viewing is the creation of movements of frustration against elected government and constitutional government. Of course, in Europe, elected government was even more recent than in the United States. I mean, it only existed in Germany maybe 50 years. I don't know how it worked in France. I'm less familiar with that. In Britain, it existed for 200 years, except it didn't mean anything. I mean, they didn't have to bother creating a dictatorship in Britain because Britain is a liberal dictatorship. That's what it is. I mean, in other words, they have elections. People can scream at each other in the parliament. They can even punch each other out. But the country is run by the Queen and the Queen's Privy Council and a bunch of bankers. And it really doesn't matter in the end what anybody else thinks, except this in a crowd which crisscrosses all the different political parties that exist at any one time. So Britain was sort of a little bit different. But you're talking about the continent. You're talking about, Houston Stewart Chamberlain's and Adolf Hitler's the ideology that you can rule the world if you control the heartland, that you rule the world if you control the continent of Eurasia. And that's what this fight was about. So anyway, the name they gave themselves was Synarchism, which, as I said, the American investigators who were gathering data about this called it Nazi/communism. And the communist movements were, I mean, the communist movements are more complicated because they did actually establish power in Russia, in China, in some other countries. It's different when you're actually the government than when you're a bunch of crybabies in a parliament or something like that. These parties were much more mixed and so forth of many, many different types of people. So it would be wrong, for example, to say that the Chinese Communist Party was under the control of the Synarchists. People who go that far just don't understand history. I mean, there were many factors that contributed to that formation becoming so influential after World War I. I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that World War I was really a horrible nightmare. And these mass protest parties were partly developing for very organically real reasons. But the bankers were in there with their money, their influence, their agents, and so forth. And that's where the term Synarchism comes from. The idea being also that the objective is for the financiers to become the replacement of elected government. It can exist as a shadow, as a sham, but it doesn't really exert any power, or it doesn't exist at all, or they go for full-scale dictatorship. in all the different forms in which they like to play around with this.
Thank you. That was a cohesive answer. Jim, any follow up? Let me put it that way.
No, I don't have any follow up. That was a helpful answer. Thank you.
Great. Okay, well, it is 11. And Cade, what do you think? Should we wrap up here?
Yeah, I think it's a good note to end on. Of course, if there's any final comments by anybody, for sure.
Yeah, go ahead, Renee. We'll let you close us out.
Well, my only disappointment, I really, thank everybody for the opportunity to share my knowledge on this, and please do whatever you want with the article. My only disappointment is I really would have loved to have heard the voices of the people speaking.
I actually let myself get kind of pissed off about that. I'm sorry.
We'll figure out what technical. I feel like I've sort of missed out on the fun, but that's okay. I roll with the punches, and I thank you all for listening. And if you want, by the way, my email, Renee Sigerson at gmail.com. That's ReneeSigerson at gmail.com. You are more than welcome to send any questions or comments that you have. It would help me to think about where to go next with this. If you're so motivated to do so, I find that very helpful. That's all I want to say.
Okay, it's been tremendous to talk to you, Renee. All right, we'll find another opportunity to talk soon, I'm sure. So thank you, everyone. Again, please join us tomorrow at 2 p.m. and let people know about it. And then if you have not already become a member of the Schiller Institute, I highly recommend it. Okay, good night. Bye-bye.